This is the indestructible phone that destroyed its own company. Nokia was once the king of the jungle, the alpha of the mobile phone industry. They were so popular that kids made countless videos about them. You could even break the screen and they would still work. So why did such an iconic brand disappear? Well, it started way before their first indestructible phone. It all started back in 1865, when two brothers decided to build a pulp mill. At the time, Finland was a poor country, and their goal was just to make some extra money. But soon they had an idea that would change everything. They invented a process that allowed them to make paper from wood chips instead of pure wood. This meant they didn't have to cut down as many trees, and it was much cheaper. It didn't take long for their business to grow. But then something unexpected happened. A Finnish rubber company went bankrupt, and the brothers took over their factory. That's when they decided to rename the company Nokia AB. With this new factory, they were able to expand to rubber products, cables, tires, belts, hoses, you name it. But once again, they ran into an unexpected problem. The factory was designed for rubber and couldn't keep up with demand. So they had to find another industry to get into. And just as they were about to go bankrupt themselves, they got a call from the Russian army. They needed respirators for soldiers who were exposed to poisonous gases. Being the smart businessmen that they were, Nokia jumped at this opportunity and began producing these life-saving devices. Of course, this was during World War I, and Nokia was supplying the enemy. So when the war ended, they feared the worst. But to their surprise, orders kept coming in. It turned out civilians were also interested in these respirators. So Nokia just kept expanding. But unfortunately, it wouldn't last forever, because in 1929, another unexpected event occurred. America and most of Europe went into the Great Depression, and no one was buying any luxuries. On top of that, there was a worldwide tire surplus, and rubber prices dropped dramatically. It was the perfect storm, and Nokia almost didn't make it. But they managed to survive. And a few years later, the next generation of Nokias took over. In 1937, they created the world's first three-piece suit made out of plastic. And you guessed it, they named it Nokia. Unfortunately, this new material was hard to come by, and World War II broke out. So they had to focus on military supplies once again. But as soon as peace returned, they went right back to where they left off. They focused on consumer electronics, and that's what made them famous. They produced TVs, radios, phonographs, computers, and game consoles. But their best product by far was the Nokia 3310. In 2000, they sold 126 million units, and this made them worth $43 billion. At this point, they controlled 40% of the market, and everyone had one. Kids used them as a brick, adults used them as a fashion statement, and gamers used them to play Snake. But how did they do it? Well, it turns out the dad of the modern cell phone is none other than Martin Cooper. He worked at Motorola, and in 1973 he made the first public cell phone call. But 10 years later, the government made cell phones available to the public. And this is when companies like Nokia entered the scene. They saw an opportunity to make billions and invested heavily into R&D. They wanted to be the first ones to market, and boy, did they deliver. But behind the scenes, things were starting to fall apart. The Nokia 3310 was so popular that it overshadowed all their other products. Their executives were stuck in a trap of their own making. They only had one hit product and missed out on every emerging technology. While Apple was building smartphones, they were busy creating flip phones. And while Samsung was focusing on touchscreen displays, they were busy creating the Indestructible series. The first phone to kick off this series was the Nokia 600, which was released in 2003. It had a tough polycarbonate body and was water resistant. But the real deal came 3 years later. In 2006, they released the Nokia 3320 and then the Nokia 5530. Both phones looked the same, but the 5530 was supposed to be indestructible. It featured a polycarbonate unibody design, meaning there were no separate parts. So if you dropped it, nothing would break. The screen was also extremely durable, and so was the charging port. And to top it all off, it was also waterproof. There was only one problem though. These phones weren't exactly good phones. Their cameras were blurry, their displays were low resolution, and they were incredibly slow. But people didn't care. Having a phone that could survive a drop was more important than having a good camera. At least, that's what they thought. In reality, the durability was kind of overrated. It could withstand a small fall, but anything higher than that, and it would crack. Still, that was enough for people to buy it. By 2008, the series sold 250 million units. And while sales were going down everywhere else, their sales were going up. Just look at Apple. Their iPhone sales peaked at 231 million units in 2015 and have been dropping ever since. But guess what? Nokia's sales are following the same trend. So now you might be thinking, if their sales were going up, why did the company fail? Well, this brings us to the second problem. Nokia didn't manufacture their own chips, screens, or software. All of those components were manufactured by their competitors, which put them at a huge disadvantage. Let me explain. Apple designs all of their products in-house, from the hardware to the software to the marketing. Sure, they outsource some of the manufacturing, but everything else is done in-house. This allows them to set the standards. They don't have to worry about some supplier releasing a lower quality product because they read the supplier. But this was a luxury that Nokia didn't have. Samsung was their biggest competitor, and they were constantly trying to outdone them. They released faster, sleeker, and more advanced products, which gave them a huge edge. Not only that, but the smartphone market was a landmine. Google released Android and iOS in 2008, which gave consumers free options. Before that, everybody was using Symbian, but now people were switching to iOS and Android. Nokia tried to jump on the trend by releasing their first touchscreen phone in 2007, but it was too late. By the time Nokia switched to touchscreen phones, it was already a red ocean. Apple had captured the high-end market, and Android had captured the low-end market. There simply wasn't room for Nokia. This was their last stand. They tried to reinvent themselves yet again, but it was simply too late. So this brings us to the question, why did Apple and Samsung survive, while Nokia didn't? Well, that comes down to three factors. First of all, Samsung focuses on more than just smartphones. They're a giant conglomerate with over 60 subsidiaries, and while their mobile division has taken a hit, their other businesses are doing well. Secondly, Apple reinvented themselves. When Steve Jobs came back to Apple, he turned the company around and focused on premium products. This allowed them to survive the shift towards smartphones. And finally, both Apple and Samsung are based in countries that value innovation. They had access to the best talent, which gave them a huge edge. On the other hand, Nokia was trapped in a small market with limited resources. Their best employees left as soon as they could. They operated under a cloud of mediocrity and ultimately failed. To make matters worse, Microsoft bought them for $7.2 billion in 2014, but even they couldn't save them. And this brings us back to the title of this video. Nokia's phones may have been indestructible, but their company most certainly wasn't. But hey, at least we have the memories. Speaking of memories, I have a question for you. What was your first phone? Comment that down below. Also drop a like if you missed Nokia's. And of course, consider checking out our international channels to watch our videos in other languages, and consider subscribing to see more questions logically answered. But until then, I'll see you guys on the next one.